So tonight's topic for the Ag in the Evening program series is reproduction, but really from a reproduction standpoint, looking at pregnancy determination and looking at some considerations from a calving season standpoint. So I want to start off with pregnancy determination. And if you're looking for a good resource to kind of have on hand, Bruce Carpenter, my colleague out at Fort Stockton, L.R. Sprott, who's a retired beef cattle specialist out of Bryan College Station, and then Kai Poehler, who's on our research teaching staff at College Station, did a really nice job with this publication here, determining pregnancy in cattle. And it's got a lot of detail and information in it if you are looking for that reference to have on hand. And you can get it off the beef.tamu.edu website. And I'll show that website again at the end, but it's just beef.tamu.edu. So when we think about pregnancy determination in cattle, one of the questions that often comes up is, what are the benefits, and is it something you really need to do in your operation? And it kind of depends from operation to operation how valuable it's going to be, and even within an operation, whether we're talking mature cows or we're talking heifers. I'm going to tell you, I'm a big proponent of always pregnancy testing heifers, just because we know there's going to be some opens in that group, and we want to go ahead and get them identified so we can either cull those heifers or manage them differently or try to rebreed them. So big proponent in always pregnancy checking heifers. When it comes to the cow herd, if it's a year where we've had good rain and those cows are in good body condition score and your history on mature cows is really good, then it may or may not make sense for you to pregnancy test those cows. It's valuable, but some people will make the decision in that standpoint, it's just not worth their effort. The other thing there too that may determine how important it's going to be for you is hopefully you're able to be out there and watching those cows some during the breeding season. And if you see those cows get bred and then you're not seeing any of them come back into heat, that's a good sign that we have a high percentage of them bred, and hopefully everything's on track. In contrast, if we're not seeing any cows come into heat, which that may have been the case for some this year, or especially moving into next year, if we don't get those cows in the right body condition, then pregnancy testing is going to be very important if we're not seeing those cows come into heat, because some of them may not be cycling back. Or if we see cows come into heat, but then, and they're bred by a bull, but then they come back into heat 18 to 21 days later, that's another indication where it's going to be really important. So just kind of as a recap there, heifers, probably a good deal always to do it. Mature cows, if they're in good condition and everything's going right, and you see them get bred, but you don't see them come back into heat, you may decide to skip it in that situation. If you don't ever see a large portion of those cows coming into heat, then definitely want to look at pregnancy checking there. Or if you see them come into heat, get bred, and then come back into heat, definitely want to look at pregnancy testing there. And then if we look at a situation like this year where most of us are going through a drought, and if we look at the next 90-day forecast, unfortunately, it's calling for dry weather to continue. Hopefully, when we get to the first of the year, we'll start getting more normal rainfall at that point in time. But if we're in a situation with limited forage supplies, knowing the pregnancy status of those animals is very valuable. And then if we want to increase our marketing options for those open cows or those cull cows, knowing pregnancy status is important there. And then if you're trying to make plans for how many replacement heifers to keep, that's another benefit of normal pregnancy determination, is so you can know whether you need to keep more or less replacement heifers in that situation. And then if we kind of look at it from a feeding standpoint, we could, by knowing which cows are bred versus those open cows, if we're going to keep those open cows, or even if if we would end up selling them later, by knowing pregnancy status, we could reduce how much we were feeding those open cows or those really short-bred cows for about 6 to 7 months. And what I mean by 6 to 7 months, or how I got to that point in time, if we look at normally palpating around weaning time, which is when most people would do it, it's going to be about 4 months before those cows are going to start calving. So if we palpate at weaning and we have open cows, we can go ahead and reduce the feed for 4 months until the calving season. But if you don't palpate them, you're not going to know immediately at the beginning of the calving season. It's really not going to be towards the end of the calving season that you're going to know those cows didn't get bred. So if we look at that 4 months between weaning and start of the calving season, and then a 3-month calving season, that's where we're looking at 6 to 7 months of reduced feeding for those open cows compared to if we didn't know they were open. So when we think about determining pregnancy, there's going to be 3 main methods we can use to determine pregnancy. Rectal palpation, and that's used to be the most common. Rectal ultrasound, we see that used a little bit more often now, or especially in seed stock operations and those kind of things. And then the use of blood test has really increased the last 10 years or so. And we'll talk about some of the options there and how to collect those blood samples. First, kind of as a reminder, when we think about rectal palpation, really is not practical until about after 45 days of breeding. There are some extremely highly skilled technicians that maybe can reliably call at 30 or 35 days. But when we look at not disturbing that early embryo and getting to a size where we're going to be much more accurate, we're really looking at 45 days or later from a rectal palpation standpoint. The other thing is, a lot of times you'll see people that they'll get them pregnancy checked, or you go to a special replacement female cell or to the weekly auction, and they'll say she's 6 months bred or 7 months bred or 8 months bred or however along. Really, once we get past about 110 to 120 days, it's very, very difficult to accurately call months of pregnancy at that point in time. And the reason, or one of the reasons being, is the palpator doesn't know, is that calf going to be 50 pounds at birth, or is that calf going to be 150 pounds at birth? So that can really throw off some things. And so, especially when we get into that 3rd trimester, it's probably more accurate just to call trimester at that point in time and just say they're long bred. Now, if somebody wants to call them by months, that's fine. It's just realize there's going to be less accuracy around aging on those longer pregnancies compared to those earlier pregnancies. Another thing with rectal palpation, it is something that you can kind of lose your feel over time. So if you're just palpating cows once a year, that makes it a little more challenging than if it's somebody who's palpating cows on a weekly basis. This is a graph that I actually pulled out of that publication I showed you earlier, and this kind of highlights why it can be challenging to really age or accurately age those fetuses in late gestation. So if we look at the solid line here is going to be weight. The dotted line would be inches if you were measuring that embryo or fetus, and then we have the 3 different stages of gestation. So the first 3 months there, you can see very little weight from that fetus. It's starting to grow in length a little bit, but weight is still really low. Stage 2, again, we continue to grow in length and width of that fetus, and not much growth in weight that first month there, but once we get past month 4 there, you see that start increasing. And then really when we get past month 6 and we get into that 3rd trimester, that's where we really see that weight increase of that fetus. Again, they continue to pretty steady growth in length, but exponential growth in weight there. And so that's one of the reasons it's very challenging to age those fetuses once we get past about 6 months. They are really past 4 to 5 months. This is another figure out of that publication I put in here just to help folks visualize and kind of think about how size changes over time. And then also, if you are palpating, kind of what somebody would be feeling at that point in time. So it breaks it down by stage of gestation, but then also days of gestation. And just like we saw in that previous slide, those early pregnancies are really small. When we're talking less than 90 days of gestation, the fetus itself. So the previous slide also accounted for uterine fluid weight and stuff. This is just looking at fetal size only. 3 to 6 ounces at less than 90 days, 120 days, 1 to 2 pounds, 150, 5 to 8 pounds, 180, 10 to 16. And then you can see when we get 210 to 270 days, how much that weight can really vary, especially when we get out there closer to calving. So kind of a little reminder on rectal palpation, and again, really 45 days or more is what we want to think about. If somebody's going to ultrasound, we can do a really good job at 30 days or further with pregnancy status. We can get some, 25, 26 days, or sometimes even a little earlier, but really to be consistent in that accuracy, we're looking at 30 days or more there. And so with ultrasound, we can determine whether they're pregnant or not. There is the potential for fetal sexing to determine whether that fetus is going to be a bull calf or a heifer calf. The range for that is from about 50 to 120 days, but really that optimum window where that technician can do a better job of fetal sexing the majority of those calves is going to be from about 55 to 70 days. The other advantage an ultrasound would provide is we can get a good look at the ovary and any other reproductive structures. And that gets used more when we think about embryo transfer or something like that, or if a veterinarian is trying to diagnose a reproductive problem in those animals. So like I said earlier, blood tests are something that's really increased in use over the last 10 years or so. As far as samples that you would collect and send to the lab, there's 3 different companies that are providing tests. There's a lot of different labs, and depending on the lab would depend on which one of these tests they're offering. So you would just go to the company website and you can see some of the available options on where to send those. Really kind of the first one out there was the bioprene test. And it's designed to pick pregnancies up 28 days after breeding on cows. Now, there is a caveat. They do have to be 73 days post-calving. And the reason they have to be 73 days post-calving, because that compound that's being measured to determine whether they're pregnant or not, it's there when that cow calves, because that fetus was still generating that compound. So we have to give time for it to clear out of the system from that previous pregnancy. So that's why you have that 73-day post-calving time frame there. That's really not a big deal when we think about when we would typically be checking pregnancy in most herds. And even if we wanted to do it like early, like this year because of drought, and we wanted to pick up those pregnancies earlier than we normally do, again, the 73 days post-calving really doesn't cause us too much problem. Bioprene does have, if it is for heifers only, then 25 days post-breeding is kind of their cutoff, so they can go just a little bit earlier there. And typically what you'll see from a result standpoint on these blood tests, they'll either say they're pregnant, they'll say they're open, or they may say you need to recheck. And the reason they may say you need to recheck is because maybe that cow's pregnant, but she's a little before that 25 or 28 day cutoff for this particular test, or maybe she got pregnant and where she's experiencing an early embryonic death, meaning she got pregnant, but she's going to lose that pregnancy. And so there's still some level of that metabolite there, but it's starting to decrease. And so they put a recheck on there so you can come back and retest and either confirm, nope, she lost that pregnancy, or nope, she has progressed where she's a little further down the line, and so she's definitely pregnant. So bioprene is one of the options out there. It was the first one available. Iodex is another one, and Iodex actually has several different tests, but the one we're talking about here that would get sent to the lab is what they're referred to as their Iodex Alertis ruminant pregnancy test. It's 28 days post-breeding for cows and heifers, a 60-day post-calving window on it. It looks at several different metabolites associated with pregnancy, called pregnancy-associated glycoproteins, or PAGs would be the term they would use on their website if you look at the website. And then the third option is one called DG29, which is typically marketed through Genex, which is a semen supply company. It's for 29 days post-breeding for cows or heifers, but a 90-day post-calving window there. So it's important just to kind of make sure you double check those dates depending on which one of these tests you're going to use based on which lab you're going to send that to. So all the ones I just mentioned would be you collect the blood, send that off. Now, as far as turnaround time, typically most of the labs, if they get the test one day, they would have results for you, maybe that same day, but typically that next day would be more common. Now, here more recently, there have been some tests developed that a veterinarian could run in their clinic, and I don't have that one on the particular slide here. The more recent one is one by Iodex that they call their Alertis on-farm pregnancy test, which is designed for a producer, or veterinarian, or whoever to actually run that basically shoot side, and you could have those results within about 5 to 20 minutes, just depending on how quickly the positive showed up there. It is approved for 28 days post-breeding for cows or heifers. Now, it's a little bit different than the Iodex lab test, whereas it's 70 days post-calving. So just be aware of that. If you send the Iodex to the lab 60 days post-calving, if you're using the on-farm or what a lot of people refer to as the shoot side, it's 70 days post-calving. Again, they're looking at the same PAGs in that situation. From a cost standpoint on the lab test, it'll depend some on what lab you send it to, but typically you're looking at about $2 to $5 per head cost there. On the on-farm test, if you buy a kit of those tests, which they come in a box of 25, this is going to be without a syringe or a blood tube that you would need, so that would be an additional cost there. But that box of 25 from most of the retailers is running about $189. So that'd be about $7.56 per test. If you kind of want a package deal, Bovine Elite, and I'm sure some others are doing this as well, but Bovine Elite on their website, you can buy a single test and it'll come with a 3cc syringe and needle and the blood tube, and that's $10 per each one of those kits. So if you didn't want to, if you wanted to try it and didn't want to commit to a box of 25, Bovine Elite, they're out of the Bryan College Station area. You could just buy individual kits if you wanted to. Figured I'd take just a minute and kind of walk through that on-site test, or that shoot side test, to kind of let you know what would be involved there and kind of what those results would look at. So basically you're going to collect a blood sample, and that's going to be the same whether you send it to the lab or where you do the shoot side test. For that shoot side test, you're going to want to put that blood in a purple top tube. And then when you get ready to actually run it, they have this little plastic pipette that you suck the blood out of the tube, You put it in this little cassette here, which that would be step 3. Step 4 is you're actually they give you a wash solution. You're going to squeeze it. So kind of think about like eye drops, a little bottle like that would be kind of similar to that. You're going to squeeze 6 little drops in that same reservoir where you put the blood, and then you're going to let it set, and you're going to read those results roughly 5 to 20 minutes later. If they show up where you can read them at 5, you're good to go. If not, then you kind of want to wait at least 20 minutes. So what are those results going to look like? So the top row would all be positive results, meaning each one of those animals is pregnant. So the C stands for a control strip. So that's kind of a check to test to let you know the test ran appropriately. So if you don't see that line there, which you see it in all 4 of these, that's what you want. If you don't see it, that's a concern. And then the T means that's the test line. If you see a line there, that animal's pregnant. So this one's pregnant, this one's pregnant. You only see half of a line there, but it's still pregnant. This is the one that can kind of get a little frustrating for people, is there's a line there, but it's very faint. Now that one would still be pregnant, but it's not kind of easy to see as what you may like it to be in all situations. So be aware of that. The next one here shows you what an open animal would look like. So again, the control has a nice line there like we want, but then there's no kind of line on the test. So that animal's definitely open. If you get one back like this where we don't have a line on that C level, then that tells you the test didn't work appropriately and you would need to recheck that animal. So that kind of shows you what that is. That's something some people are going to want to try. Some other people are going to say, I think I'll just go ahead and send that to the lab or use one of the other methods. But that is a method that's out there. I would suspect with time, we'll see the cost probably come down just a little bit on that. So how do we go about collecting that blood sample? Don't worry if you've never collected blood before. It's not as hard as it seems if you will follow a couple little tips. So there's some videos you can go online and watch those videos. The way, or what I recommend for people to do is watch the video, but instead of using a vacutainer needle, or what some people call a blood needle, which is just a needle that goes into the animal, but then also goes into the blood tube at the same time, I would use a 3 cc syringe and needle. It works so much better. So the nice thing with the 3 cc syringe and needle is you can pull a little pressure on there, or if you're not in the right spot, you can pull out and go back in without having to worry about losing any vacuum. So it's when you're learning, and even after you learn, it's much easier to draw those blood samples with a syringe and then take that syringe and put the blood in the blood tube versus using a vacutainer needle and going directly into the blood tube. So this picture, he's actually using a vacutainer and going directly into the tube here. Why I don't recommend that when you're starting out especially is because it's real hard to tell if you're in the right spot or not. And you have to put it in there, and then when you think you're in the right spot, you put the blood tube on the needle, and there's a vacuum in that blood tube, and it will suck the blood in there. The problem is that animal jumps, or you're not in the right spot, and it's real easy to lose that vacuum on that needle, or excuse me, on that blood tube. So that's why I would use a syringe instead of the vacutainer needle to kind of just highlight how big of a difference that can make. There's a gentleman I know who he had talked to somebody who had some experience bleeding some cattle and offered to come out and help him bleed some so they could check them for pregnancy. And needless to say, it just didn't go well. They just couldn't get the blood samples collected like they wanted, and they ended up just giving up. And so he was relaying that story to me. And I told him, I said, well, y'all were using blood tubes directly, and that makes it much harder. I said, I can show you how to do it with the syringe, and it'll be a whole lot easier for you. And he wasn't, real sure. And he came back to me later. He said, if you're willing to show me, we can try it. So in that case, I went out there and to help him. And so I bled the first three heifers in that situation. He kind of saw how it went. He said, can I try on the next one? I was like, well, yeah, that's what I'm here for, is to help you learn how to do this. So on the next one, he did it and bled that heifer, no problem, and ended up bleeding all the rest of the heifers we had brought up that day. He just was really shocked at how big of a difference it was using a syringe versus using that vacutainer needle. So just really want to emphasize that. And when we bleed, what you want to do is just lift that tail up, and you can kind of see there'll be a depression in the middle, and then you'll see those vertebrae. You want to go in that middle, and then you want to go in between the vertebrae. And after a little time, you'll start getting a feel, and you can kind of tell when you're in the right spot and when you're not. And it may take you a few little tries initially, but you'll get the hang of it. And I think I feel pretty comfortable with it fairly quickly. Another little tip is when you lift that tail up, you do want it kind of straight. If it has a bend to it, let it back down and lift it up again. That'll help you. Or if you're having trouble, let it back down and lift it up again, and that'll help you out there. This is just an example of one of those videos that's out there, and this is just showing the vertebrae, but that's that kind of middle depression I was talking about. So that's where you want to go, but then you want to go here in between the vertebrae and the tail. The other thing I would do is start further out towards the end of the tail. So if you get a hematoma or something, you can move back closer to the body and work with vessels that don't have that hematoma. If you start real close to the body and you get a hematoma, then you don't really have any place to move to. So that's another little tip just to be aware of. So when we think about blood, using the blood test, you're going to need a syringe, and you're not going to need a blood tube. And depending on which test will determine which blood tube you need. A lot of times you can get a kit directly from the company. If you want to purchase the items individually, which may be a little cheaper that way, two sources a lot of people use are Airtight and then Animal Health International. And just kind of give you some estimated cost. I'll typically buy 3cc syringes with a needle on them and a box of 100. And those have historically been running about $7 to $8. Obviously, they fluctuate a little bit more right now. But at $7 to $8 for 100 of them, you're talking about 7 to 8 cents per syringe needle combination there. Plastic blood tubes, if you're going to be mailing them, $13 to $15. So again, 13 to 15 cents. So I can have my syringe and my blood tube, and then the cost of the test, I may be looking at $3 to $3.50 a head or less if I'm going to send that off. Obviously, if I'm using the shoot side test, there's a little more expense there. So that's really what I wanted to talk about from a pregnancy determination standpoint. I'm going to take about the next 10 minutes or so here, and we'll talk about some of the benefits of a set calving season, and then also when we want to calve and when we don't want to calve in most parts of Texas. So one of the big benefits of a set calving season is just reduced labor. It's reduced time you're out there checking calves or checking cows that may be calving, because we know what time of the year they're going to be calving and when. It makes processing much easier, so we can do that once a year rather than multiple times a year. From a marketing standpoint, it gives us a whole lot more options, and then we have less trips to town to sell those calves. So reduce labor all the way around. we're much better able to manage the nutritional needs of the cow herd. If we look at nutrient requirements for lactating cows versus non-lactating cows, there's a significant difference there. So just kind of as a reminder, and those of you who watched other Ag in the Evening events, you've probably seen this slide, but it just highlights the importance of not having to always feed dry and lactating cows together. So those lactating cows, if we let them eat all the hay or forage they want, we would need 11.5 to 12.5% protein, depending on age, 60 to 61% TDN. In comparison, if we look at dry cows, that 2-year-old coming 3-year-old, so getting ready to have her second calf, a couple of weeks before calving, about 9% protein, 58% TDN. A mature cow, about 2 weeks before calving, about 8.5% protein, 55% TDN. So if we look at that mature cow around peak lactation versus that mature cow a couple weeks per calving, huge difference in nutrient requirements there, 8.5 versus 12.5% protein, 55 versus 61% TDN. So there's feeding costs that we can save by having all those cows calve at the same time. Whereas if we have both lactating and non-lactating cows in the group, we're always going to be overfeeding those non-lactating cows so that we can meet the nutrient requirements of the lactating cows. With the fixed calving season, it typically lends itself to increased market opportunities. So it makes it much easier to wean calves because we're weaning them all at once. Whereas if we're calving year round, you're probably not going to be willing to wean calves multiple times a year. By weaning those calves, it gives us the option for special calf sales. May give us the option, if we had some extra grass, to retain ownership of those calves through a stocker phase. We could go to special stocker and feeder sales, or we may look at, if we had enough cattle, we could potentially sell in truckload lots. So a whole lot more marketing opportunities there with that fixed calving season. So when we think about length of the breeding season, how long does it need to be, or how short does it need to be? And I'm going to tell you, we definitely don't want to go any longer than 90 days, and we'll kind of work through why that's the case. Some people like to go shorter. That's fine. I personally don't go shorter. We run a 90-day season. The reason being is I can have a 90-day breeding season with the majority or even all those cows really calving in that first 45 or 60 days. Having that extra 30 days compared to a 60-day breeding season to 90-day breeding season just gives me some opportunity to pick up some cows that may have not got bred for whatever reason. So if you want to go down to 45 or 60, nothing wrong with that. 90 works really well. We don't want to go longer than 90. And the reason we don't want to go longer than 90 is we greatly increase the risk of that herd bull breeding some of those older heifers that are still nursing the cow. So if we kind of think about a winter calving scenario, so we're calving in January, that means we would turn those bulls in around April 5th. We took them out around July 4th. That would give us a 90-day breeding season in that scenario. So from a calving standpoint, that means that first calf would be born roughly around January 5th. That last calf could be born up to about April 25th. And that would be a 110-day window. And you say, well, how did we go from a 90-day breeding season to a 110-day calving season? Is realize that gestation length varies. And we'll talk about it more in a minute. We'll talk about averages of 279 to 285 days typically, but there's cows that are shorter than that, and there's cows that are longer than that. So just to kind of represent how that can vary there some. So if we looked at, that's when we turn that bull in, that first calf maybe as early as January 5th there, then when we remove that bull, so I put these on top of each other so you could see. So when we remove that bull here around July 4th, If that first calf was born around January 5th, it would be roughly 6 months old at that point in time. So if you think about, well, if we extended that to 120-day breeding season, now we're talking about those calves even older. And so we want to make sure we don't have that breeding season too long, because it greatly increases our risk of those heifer calves getting bred. And those 6, 7 month old, sometimes even younger heifer calves that are nursing that cow, some of those will come into heat, and a 2,200-pound herd bull will breed those heifers. And it happens way, way more than what people realize. If you're not willing to have a fixed breeding season where you remove the bulls, then really in that situation, I would suggest you market those heifers by the time they're about 5 months of age, definitely no older than 6 months of age. It's a big problem in the industry, and the best way to solve it is with a fixed breeding season. And there's a lot of other benefits we have with that fixed breeding season. And then that's just showing you we wouldn't be weaning those calves until after the bull was removed. Whereas if we kept that bull out longer, those, there's still time for some of those heifers to get bred, which we want to avoid that scenario. So shorter than 90 days, fine. Definitely don't want to go longer than 90 days. So another question that kind of comes up that take the opportunity to talk about what we're on this slide is when do we need a calf? What's an ideal calving season? And there's a lot of options, especially for producers in Central Texas, East Texas, South Texas. And that could be fall calving, that could be late winter calving, or that could be springtime calving. There's pros and cons to all those when we think about a fall calving operation. So calving mid-September through the fall, or maybe even 1st of October through the fall, is those calves will typically be sold in the spring at the peak of calf prices, or during the summer at the peak of those feeder cattle prices. So calving in the fall helps you sell calves at a better time. The disadvantage of calving during the fall is you're going to have potentially more feeding expenses in those cattle. The key to calving in the fall is you have to have a good winter pasture program. If you don't have a good winter pasture program, calving in the fall is probably not going to be a good option for you. If we look at a late winter calving time frame, that works really well for a lot of producers in East Texas. So really thinking about calving late January, February, early part of March. We have some calves that are pretty decent size when we get all that forage production, typically in May in that situation. So that works well for a lot of producers. And then calving later spring can work well, especially if you don't have any volunteer ryegrass, so that we wait and we're much closer to that flush of that Bermuda grass in that situation. So either one of those three works fine. What we want to avoid is going to be calving during the summer. And the reason we want to avoid calving during the summer is those baby calves do not handle that heat well, and we have the potential of losing some of those calves to heat stress. Now, if we were out in West Texas in the Davis Mountains or that area, summer calving may actually make sense for us because the temperatures are more reasonable out there in that area. Plus, when we look at when their rainfall patterns are, that could work really well. But for Central Texas and East Texas, we're really looking at fall calving, late winter calving, or spring calving. So if you are in a year-round calving season, how do we convert to a fixed calving season? So there's several different ways to do it. One of the ways that probably works best for most people is to go in there and decide, all right, we're going to have a 90-day calving season in the spring and a 90-day calving season in the fall. And so we're going to turn those bulls out to match those two calving seasons. And then over time, you could discontinue one of those herds if you wanted to. But the nice thing about initially doing a spring and a fall, transitioning from year round, is we limit the amount of time we're dealing with open cows there. So we catch those cows in one of those two groups pretty quickly. So we're not sitting there having a cow that's open for 7 or 8 or 9 months while we're transitioning to that fixed breeding season. Now, you may decide that you like calving twice a year, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're just going to have a spring calving herd and a fall calving herd there. But that's the way I think works best for most people to convert from 365-day calving. The other thing you could do is just over time kind of shrink things on both ends of that, but much easier if we'll just go to a spring calving and a fall calving. Unfortunately, with the drought conditions, we may need to look at culling some cattle right now. One thing we could do to use that to help our operation is go in there and get those cattle palpated or ultrasound, where we kind of know how long they are bred or which ones are open. And we could use that to convert from year-round calving to a fixed calving season just based on our culling strategies, or we could use those culling strategies to tighten up a longer calving season down into that 90-day calving window or less. Question that always comes up is, what do you do with the bulls and how hard is it to manage the bulls? It's really not as hard as what you think it is to manage those bulls outside of the breeding season. If you have a pasture on the corner of the property you can go to with them, that works really well. What I would encourage you to do is just run an electric fence along that permanent fence, and that will keep those bulls from testing that fence and keep them where you need them. If you needed to, you could even just use electric fence to isolate those bulls. If you're going to do that, I'd probably use 3 strands of electric there, but that's another option. So just getting those bulls to a corner of the property or a certain part of the property and using electric fence in conjunction with your permanent fence works extremely well. The other thing is, after a few weeks of being away from those cows, those bulls generally settle down pretty well, and they're not paying much attention to those cows. The other thing is, when we get converted to that fixed breeding season, we're going to get all those cows bred, hopefully. And so that bull's not worried about open cows either, even if the cows are grazing in an adjacent pasture. The other thing you can do, so you don't have to have the bulls separated for as long if you want to, or to help pick up any cows that may have got bred but then slipped, is so put the bull out there for the 90 days during the breeding season, bring him back and separate him. And then once you wean those calves, then you could take and kick that bull back with the cow herd, or those bulls back with the cow herd, until the cows start calving again. And that does a couple things. One, it reduces the amount of time you have to have that bull or those bulls separated from the cows if it's easier for you to have things together. And then if you do have any cows that were to come up open or lose a pregnancy and then cycle back, you could have those bulls there to get those cows bred. And then you're selling a bred cow later on rather than an open cow. Just make sure once those cows start calving, you go ahead and get that bull pulled back out of there so that you don't have any cows bred before you want them to. So I mentioned gestation length earlier, and what I was figuring off on that slide was roughly 285 days. And that's what we'll talk about a lot of times, is 283 to 285 days for gestation length. But those averages do vary by breed. Some recent data released by the Angus Foundation is, on average, they're running about 279 days. Compared that to something like Brahman on average will run about 292 days. And then when we take all those cattle together, that's how we get that 283 to 285 day typical average. However, within a breed, gestation length will vary as well. So especially if we're looking at lower birth weight or easy calving genetics, they tend to have a little shorter gestation length. One benefit of that shorter gestation length is that gives that cow a little longer to get rebred and maintain that calving interval. So if we just think about a 285-day gestation, for that cow to calve every 12 months, she would need to breed back within 80 days of when she had that calf. So 285 plus 80 would be 365. If you look at shorter gestation length, they have a little longer than that 80 days to breed back and have that calf. If we look at something on the other side that has longer than a 285-day gestation, then they have a shorter window they would have to breed back to maintain that yearly calving interval. The other thing is gestation length will be affected by time of the year, and that's typically a temperature effect. So if we look at fall calving versus spring calving, and we were looking at the same genetics, those calves born in the fall would typically be born a couple days earlier than the same genetics would be born in the spring. And that typically has to do with temperature. And because of the temperature and that earlier calving, is those fall born calves will be a little bit lighter typically than a spring born calf. And then on the bottom right here, this was some data put together by a gentleman several years ago, a specialist out of the Northwest, where he looked at gestation length on 140 Angus cows, and he broke them into groups, 272 to 275 days of gestation, 276 to 278, 279 to 283, 284 to 291. So you can see even within that breed, there's that variation we were talking about. So with that, any questions anybody has about tonight's topic or any other beef cattle topic?